am Catty Patty and welcome back to another game analysis video. This time I'm going to be covering What Remains of Edith Finch. If you know anything about the game, it just follows the storyline of a girl named Edith who inherits her family home after tragedy happens and basically her entire family passes away. For this video, I decided to put all of the deaths in chronological order. So if you do play the game or if you have played the game, these events are not how they happen in the game that I'm going to be listing. They are out of order in the game. But I just thought it would be more interesting if it was in chronological order of how everything happened and kind of piece the story together as it went. And we're also going to talk about what happened, if this family is cursed, what is going on. Through the game, we have a book with us of the family tree, and after each story, Edith draws a picture of the family member and then moves on to the next, starting with this and ending with this. There's a lot of family members here, all with their own stories, so let's get started. Odin. So we are going to be starting off with Odin. In 1880, he was born in Norway. He was the father to Edie and one other child, Johan, who seemed to pass away with Odin's wife, Ingeborg. In 1937, believing that the family was cursed, Odin decided to move the family from Norway to Orcas Island in Washington. He packed up his daughter Edie, her husband Sven, and their firstborn Molly, boarded a ship that quite literally had their house just on it, ready to go, and sailed across the ocean to their new destination. As they approached their new homeland, however, the ship was struck by 40-foot waves, destroying the home and killing Odin. He was then buried at the site of the new home, making him the first Finch to be buried in the family graveyard at the house. He died at the age of 57. So this first death kind of gives us a little bit of information about the Finch family. To start, it mentions in his picture slides that the Finch family was known in Norway for their fortune and misfortune. It also says that Odin was burying the latest victim of the family curse. When this is stated, it shows a picture of the graveyard with many other headstones. This graveyard is back in Norway, so that kind of assumes that the family had another family graveyard due to this curse back in Norway, and they started a new one once Odin died in Washington. This tells us that the curse has been going on for a while already, and it's well known to not only the Finches, but the people around them too. Molly. Molly is actually the first death that we do experience in the game. She is the firstborn to Edie and Sven, coming across from Norway with them in her first year of life. In December of 1947, Molly was sent to her room without dinner. As the night goes on, she starts to get hungry. So hungry, in fact, she can't bear it and starts looking around her room for things to eat. She begins to eat whatever she can find, including gerbil food, toothpaste, and some holly berries. At this point, the story of Molly gets pretty weird. She starts to hear a bird outside her window, and since she's still hungry, she turns into a cat and chases after it. Once she's caught the bird, her hunger still isn't satisfied, so she turns into an owl and begins to hunt rabbits. After she catches a couple, she now becomes a shark and rolls down a hill into the ocean and starts attacking a seal. Since this seems to not satisfy her either, she becomes a sea monster and eats the crew off of a ship. Once the crew is devoured, she mentions smelling something she had to have and starts to follow the scent through a pipe that leads back into her bathroom. She, still as the monster, slithers across her floor and under her bed. Suddenly, she becomes herself once more and writes in her journal that she was holding her breath for a long time and that something is waiting for her to fall asleep, leaving one last cryptic statement in her journal.
But it's not going to wait much longer. It needs to feed, and we both know I will be delicious.
I know what you're thinking. What the fuck? Trust me, I thought that too, but here's what I believe happened to Molly Finch on that final night. Molly was sent to bed hungry. Not able to stand the hunger, she starts eating things around her room that she definitely shouldn't be consuming. After she has a bad reaction to the clearly not safe for human consumption items, she begins to hallucinate. If you look around Molly's room, you can find decorations of the creatures that she imagines turning into in the hunt for more food. On her shelf is a plushie of a shark. Hanging on her wall and bedroom door are masks of birds and owls. She even has a sea monster drawn on her chalkboard. As her hallucination goes on, she begins choking. During her second feast on a rabbit, she says,
I started choking, but I couldn't stop eating.
while a heartbeat starts to pound in the background. As her hallucinations are coming to an end, she crawls back towards her bed where she becomes herself again. The end is close at this point, as she describes she's been holding her breath, possibly referring to her choking, and that it's waiting for her to fall asleep so it can devour her, possibly referring to death itself. Molly passed away at the age of 10 in 1947. Barbara. In 1960, Barbara was left home alone to babysit her younger brother while her parents made a trip to the emergency room. Her boyfriend Rick was staying with them, attempting to help her get her scream back. Barbara was a childhood star, known for her iconic scream in horror movies. As she grew up, she lost her scream. However, an invite to BeastieCon encouraged her to try for her stardom once again. While practicing her scream, Rick decides she needs to be scared to get her to actually scream. He goes and hides in the basement with a mask on and jumps out to scare her when she comes looking for him. This upsets Barbara and she kicks her out for the night. Later in the night, she hears her brother in distress and goes to investigate the situation. As Barbara investigates her brother's distress, she is attacked by a man with a hook. During the altercation, she was able to hit him in the head, causing him to fall over the railing down to the first floor of the house. When she goes back downstairs to where the hook man fell, he's gone. At this moment, the doorbell rings and Barbara goes to answer it. After getting to the door, though, a bunch of teens in masks pop up behind Barbara and attack her. Barbara passed away at the age of 16. Now, one thing we do know about what happened to Barbara is that the comic about her death was dramatized. Edith, when picking up the comic book, says,
Of all the stories people wrote about Barbara's death, I'm surprised Edie saved this one.
Immediately following, our narrator for the comic says,
Old Jack here with another ghastly tale inspired by America's most unfortunate family.
Because of these two statements, I think it's safe to say we have to take whatever is being said to us with a grain of salt. I believe that the comic is just an over-the-top explanation of how a child star who was famous for monster and horror movies ended up dying on Halloween. For what really happened, there are a few theories out there, such as maybe she was skating on the top floor and tripped and fell over the balcony. But this is what I think actually happened in this scenario. I believe that Rick was over for the night helping Barbara prepare for her debut for the BeastieCon. Her parents left to take her dad to the emergency room, leaving her, Rick, and her youngest brother home alone. Throughout the night, and growing frustrated with her not being able to reproduce the scream, Rick decides to try and scare Barbara to get her to scream. So I think he set up this plan with her younger brother to scare her. Told her to call his sisters up the stairs in a panic, and then have him hide under the bed, because her younger brother was hiding under the bed the whole time. So when Barbara is coming up the stairs, Rick jumps out of Walter's room, her younger brother, and scares her. In the scare, she steps back out of fear, tripping over a skate that she had by the staircase and falling over the railing. Rick, not knowing what to do, flees the scene, never to be found again. Walter is left under his bed witnessing the whole thing. The doorbell at the end of the comic, I believe, was actually just trick-or-treaters excited to meet the childhood star. This scenario, just like most others, is a guess. However, it makes the most sense to me. One, because we know her death was dramatized in the media, and what really happened probably wasn't what the media was reporting. Two, we know someone fell through the railing, as the poorly repaired wood is one of the first things we can see upon entering the Finch home. Three, we know Barbara died where the body landed after falling over the railing, because in one of the last sections of the comic, that is the only place taped off by the police, not where her body would have been by the front door if the comic book was correct. 4, the comic mentions that Walter took it pretty hard, but that's another story. This could mean that not only did he witness the whole thing happen from under his bed, but he may have taken it hard because he was part of the plan that resulted in his sister's death. Again, this is just a theory of what happened, but this is what makes the most sense to me. Calvin. Calvin is the next death in the family and one of the more straightforward deaths of the story. In 1961, a year after Barbara passed, Calvin was on the swing outside of the family home with his brother Sam. When called in for dinner, Calvin continued to stay on the swing set. The note we find, narrated by Sam, says that Calvin always wanted to fly, but that day he finally made up his mind to do it. It's clear his intention is to try to swing a full circle around the branch when Sam says,
I told him going around was impossible. Maybe if I hadn't said that.
Calvin, I'm not gonna tell you again.
Maybe if the wind hadn't picked up, then maybe he'd still be here. But I doubt it.
As Calvin makes a loop around the tree, he lets go. Though the scene shows him flying into the ocean, it's clear that we can make the assumption he was injured by the broken fence in front of the swing where he would have landed. Calvin passed away at the age of 11. Sven. Sven is someone in the story that doesn't have any particular scenes dedicated to him. However, he is the next death in the family. Sven, husband to Edie and father to Molly, Barbara, Calvin, Sam, and Walter, was crushed by a dragon slide he was building for his son Walter's 12th birthday. He died in 1964 at the age of 49. Gregory. Now we're jumping a bit forward in time for this next death. Sam was able to grow up and marry his wife Kay, having 3 children, Dawn, Gus, and Gregory. Gregory was only a year old when he died, and it's a pretty sad story, so if you don't want to know about how this 1-year-old's life came to end, maybe skip forward a bit. The scene begins with Gregory playing in the bathtub. Kay, his mother, initially comes in to end bath time when the phone rings.
Hold on, sweetie.
You can hear her arguing with her husband Sam on the phone, as they were going through a divorce, while Gregory continues to play in the bath. After a few minutes, Kay comes back and drains the bath water. However, she's interrupted again by another phone call. During this phone call, Gregory accidentally turns the water back on. Gregory drowned in the bath before his mother was able to come back. Gus. Unfortunately, the next death in line was that of Gus, Sam's other son. In 1982, Sam was getting remarried, and being a typical teenager, Gus had no interest in taking part in the wedding events. He stood off from the wedding, choosing to fly his kite instead. As the night went on, a storm started to roll in. Sam moved the wedding party inside a tent, while Gus continued to stay outside on his own, flying his kite. However, the storm started to pick up quickly, throwing around wedding decorations and causing some chaos outside of the tent. During the chaos, a family totem pole falls over. In a case of the wrong place at the wrong time, Gus, standing right in front of the totem pole, ends up being crushed. He laid alone on the beach until his sister and father found him later that night. He died at the age of 13. Sam. Now, in a truly devastating fashion, we have the death of Sam, occurring only 1 year later. In 1983, Sam decided to take his daughter Dawn on a hunting trip. It seems at this point that Sam has really adopted a survivalist mindset, as he can be heard telling his daughter,
I'm just saying, I'm not always going to be here, Dawn. You'll need to remember this stuff, if you want to survive.
Also, this seems like Dawn's first hunting trip, as she's clearly uncomfortable having to shoot the deer that they find. After shooting the deer, the scene changes to Dawn kneeling by the deer crying, while her father is setting up the camera to take a photo. While the timer is counting down, the deer stirs, knocking Sam off a cliff, and his final moments were captured by the camera as he fell. Sam died at the age of 33. Sanjay. Sanjay is the future husband of Dawn, later on in the game, as well as the father of Lewis, Milton, and our main character, Edith. He's not really mentioned in the game very much. However, a newspaper clipping above his shrine mentions an earthquake relief effort ending in disaster. Since the game tells us that Dawn and Sanjay were big on volunteering to help with disaster relief, it can be assumed he died while volunteering. Sanjay died in 2002 at the age of 36, according to his headstone. Milton. So, Milton has been quite a mystery throughout this entire game. It's mentioned time and time again that he went missing one day and no one is quite sure what happened to him or where he is, but his disappearance is what caused Edith's mother, Dawn, to start sealing up all of the doors in the house. Milton's room was a castle built by Edie, and inside, only a few things about him can be discovered. When you first enter, you can find a canvas with a door painted on it, a few drawings on the walls of landscapes, pathways, and cities, and then a mural in a completely different art style of a frog. Lastly, above the door, you can find a self-portrait of Milton. Going up to the second floor of the castle, you find his memorial, along with a flipbook made by Milton, titled The Magic Paintbrush. As you flip through, it shows Milton painting his self-portrait, which comes to life. He then draws him drawing a flipbook of him painting a doorway and walking through it, bowing and closing the door behind him. He disappeared in 2003 at the age of 11. This is another what the fuck from this game. Where did Milton actually go? Well, the developers of What Remains of Edith Finch actually have another game called The Unfinished Swan. When you open the page in Steam for this game, the first image you are greeted with is Milton's mural of the frog. In fact, if you click through the images of this game, you can actually see the similarities in the architecture to that of what Milton drew in his castle, and you can also find his artist's signature of a mustache and crown stamped on some of the architecture for the game. So it seems that Milton may have actually drawn a portal to a new world of his own. Walter. Following the disappearance of Milton is the death of Walter, Edie's remaining son. Walter seems to not be mentioned as much in the game after he witnessed the death of his sister Barbara. So what happened to him? After we learn about Barbara's death, we are prompted to go to the basement of the house. Here we find an underground bunker stocked full of supplies and food. As we start his scene, Walter says he's been down here for 30 years and the calendar by his table is labeled 1968. He mentions that one day, shaking had started and he didn't think he'd survive. We go through the same routine every day for years, having Walter open a can of food and eating it. This happens every day at noon, exactly the same time that we can see shaking occurring throughout the bunker. Then in 2005, noon hits but no shaking occurs. He mentioned the monster outside the door being gone and being tired of waiting. After a week of no shaking, he decides he's going to leave the bunker. He goes into a crawl space and breaks open a wall that leads onto a train track. While on the track, he talks about how he's going to cherish whatever time he has left and not live in fear. As he says the words,
I can already imagine the sun on my face.
A train horn blares and the camera is covered in light. He died in 2005 at the age of 43. During Walter's story, it's clear that he's hiding in a bunker because he's scared of whatever curse the family has been taken by, calling it a monster and saying,
I know it's out there, somewhere. Whatever killed Barbara and Molly and Calvin.
However, after 30 years, he seems fed up with hiding. He finally breaks out of the bunker to try and cherish life while he still has it. I think the most unfortunate part about his death is that he's just gotten out of the bunker for the first time in 30 years. He wants to go live his life to the fullest, not knowing that he wasn't even going to have a full day. I also think the shaking he was feeling in the bunker was because of the train, and that for some reason during that 1 week, it just wasn't traveling through that area, and unfortunately it gave him a false confidence that it was safe to go outside again. Lewis. Now, to me, Lewis is one of the most heartbreaking deaths. I'm going to give another warning, as this one talks about self-unaliving. Lewis took the disappearance of Milton pretty hard. So hard, in fact, that Edith even says she thinks Lewis blamed himself. After he graduated, his mother got him a job at a local cannery, the glorious dream job of chopping fish's heads off for canning. In his room, we find a letter from an Institute of Psychology, which starts Lewis's scene. Narrated by his psychologist, we learn that he had a history of substance abuse, and as he got sober, he realized how monotonous his life actually was. However, one day he started to daydream that his life was different. He dreamed that he was an adventurer, discovering worlds and creating villages, that people were praising him. As the days went on, it becomes clear that Lewis has fallen into maladaptive daydreaming and could only get through his day at home or work if he was imagining he was somewhere in a far-off land, living a more interesting life. Unfortunately, his psychologist allowed this behavior to continue because it actually seemed he was doing better. His boss said that Lewis seemed like an entirely new person. He was focused, tireless, and a model employee. So with this behavior basically being encouraged by those around him, he fell further. As he kept pushing his imagination, he felt that the real Lewis wasn't him, and his true self was the one he'd made up. He started to despise his real-world self and I think that's when he made a final decision. He mentions to a psychologist he's going to be crowned king of all the lands of wonder, surrounded by his companions and even a cat named Molly, who was his advisor. During this scene, Lewis walks through a castle up to his king or queen, and his end becomes obvious. He bends down his head to be crowned as the guillotine falls. Lewis died in 2010 at the age of 22. Now, I think Lewis's story is one of the harder ones because not only do we see how disconnected from life he felt, but we also just learned what happened to Milton. And Lewis blamed himself for what happened to Milton. He had no idea what happened. He just thought his brother disappeared, and Lewis blamed himself for not stopping it, I guess. And I think the hard part about that is now that we know what happened to Milton, we know that he basically got the life that Lewis was dreaming for. He basically didn't feel like he could live without being that person. And I don't know. I don't think Milton ever finds out about Lewis's death. But I can't imagine how he would feel knowing that his brother took his own life because he wanted the life that Milton stumbled upon. And that just kind of like hits hard for me because Lewis thought his brother just disappeared and he was gone, and he took it really hard, and he later took his own life because he couldn't live in this world and wanted to just escape to a far off land. And Milton got that, and I don't think he ever realized that that's what his brother wanted, and I feel like if he did realize, he probably would have took Lewis with him. Edie. We are now to the death of Edith's great-grandmother Edie. After Lewis's death, Edith's mother Dawn decided enough was enough and that they needed to move from the family home to try and escape this curse. The night before their departure, we are given a scene of the 3 remaining Finches eating dinner. It's clear Edie has no intention of leaving with Dawn and Edith as she raises her glass and says,
"Our final night together, and all our final nights."
To which Dawn responds,
"Grandma, you know what I said about alcohol. Some of your medications are very specific."
As the two start arguing about what tomorrow brings, Edith is dismissed from the table. Edith goes wandering into the library as we hear the two in the background arguing about the curse.
"That thing you're afraid of isn't going to end when you leave the house. Edith has a right to know these stories."
My children are dead because of your stories. I think it's best if Edith and I leave tonight.
As Edith reaches a desk in the library, she finds a book made by Edie titled History of the Finches. Inside is a story about the house in the ocean. On the night Edith was born, the tide went so far out that you could walk the ocean floor to the destroyed Finch home. Edie describes wandering out there but getting lost in the fog. She talks about seeing weird things in the fog, things she'd forgotten had ever existed. As Edie reaches the house, the story is interrupted by Dawn pulling the book from Edith. The book is torn in half in the struggle.
Mom, you're gonna rip it! Let go!
After the altercation, the scene moves to inside the family vehicle, with Edie standing on the front porch of the house. As they drive away, Edith says,
The next morning, the van came to pick her up, but she was already gone.
Edie passed away in 2010 at the age of 93. What happened to Edie isn't very clear from what we're told. However, it is mentioned that she was mixing her medication with alcohol. By the nature of the book left for Edith, it's possible that after mixing alcohol and medication, Edie had tried to wander to the house in the ocean. Dawn. For the next few years, Dawn and Edith moved around a lot. However, it seems their efforts to escape the curse weren't working. As Dawn started to fall sick, Dawn fell to her sickness pretty quickly, and in 2016, she passed away at the age of 48. Edith. Now we are to the last of the Finch family, Edith. Edith was the player's character throughout the entire game. However, as you play, you notice that she's telling the story of her family to someone else. At first, it can be assumed she's telling the story to the player. However, partway through the game, it becomes obvious she's telling the story to her future kid when she reveals she's pregnant. This makes some of her comments throughout the game make sense, as she can be heard mentioning that there's one Finch remaining, or maybe 2. and other such comments. As we listen to what she's written for her kid, she hadn't known yet whether or not she'd still be around at this point in time. Her death is yet another tragedy, as she sounded like she was full of hope learning that she was pregnant. As we are now being born, Edith talks about how she made this journal for her child, but hopes they never see it, clearly as it means that she'd passed away if they were reading it. She said she'd rather just meet you and tell you the stories herself, but since they're reading this journal, it didn't work out that way. Edith passed away in childbirth in 2017 at the age of 18. As the game comes to an end, we are still left wondering what exactly this family curse was. It's never mentioned, however, time and time again, tragedy struck. There are a few theories about what might actually have been happening, but for now, I'm going to discuss the two that I have of my own. My first theory is that, for whatever reason, creativity and imagination is the death of this family. It's clear that that's what Dawn believes when she's decided to board up all of the doors after Milton's disappearance, and why she blames Edie's stories on her children being dead. We also had a comment at the start of the game from Edith, when she states her great-grandmother said all the Finches were buried in the library. Almost all of the deaths were documented in some storytelling, outlandish way, and it may be believed that their inability to stop documenting things and just let things go is causing the family to keep passing. My other theory, and the one that I believe a little bit more, is that the family was never actually cursed. Is it outlandish that an entire family didn't have one natural passing and all deaths were due to some unforeseen circumstances? Sure. But misfortune doesn't exactly mean cursed. I also think that the fact that Edie was able to make it to the age of 93 points to a lack of curse. I also think the fact that Milton technically isn't dead also shows that the family isn't cursed. I think they just didn't want to accept that their family was facing loss after loss and wanted something to point to for why this was happening. Unfortunately, though, no one escapes death. Death can be untimely, but it's bound to happen one day. And if we actually look at why each family member came to pass, there are only a couple of the deaths that seem a little bit of a stretch. I think the way Edie comes to document the deaths make them seem so otherworldly when that's not actually the case. The only death that was really out there wasn't even a death at all. That was Milton, who just happened to go into a different universe. But he was still alive. But in their defense, the Finches didn't know that he was still out there. All that being said, the entire meaning of the story is pretty much up to the individual player, as nothing definitive is ever stated. But I'd be curious in what your guys' opinion is of the story of this game. Please leave a comment below of what you think actually happened. I appreciate you guys for watching this video and all my other game analysis videos. I hope you enjoyed this one. And thank you for everything. I will see you next time. Bye!